This is the Zach Moore podcast, episode 24. And today's episode is going to be a little bit different. Uh, it's probably going to be a shorter one, but I'm going to do my best to try and talk about a subject which the events that are involved happened before I was ever born. And the effects are lasting probably till the end of my life. I'm talking today about, first and foremost, the new Christopher Nolan movie, Oppenheimer. I recently went and watched this movie actually at an AMC theater. There's one that's fairly close to my wife and I. We drove down there a little over a week ago and saw the movie. And going into the movie, I I had multiple ideas. Like I said earlier, I saw the actual scene of the bomb going off, and I knew about that particular scene where you had to wait for the sound. So I made sure to tell my wife that in the movie theater. I looked over at her. I was like, listen, cover your ears because this is the loudest part of the movie. It wasn't as loud as I thought it was going to be, but it was still pretty loud. But I'm glad that I had seen that beforehand, so it wasn't such a surprise. Original thoughts on the movie, my personal thoughts before we kind of dive into the whole subject and history surrounding, I guess, this movie and the different. I got a bunch of stuff on my mic. The different aspects of the events surrounding the droppings of these bombs. Originally, walking into the movie, I did not expect it to more so be about Oppenheimer outside of the creation of the bomb. I knew it was a movie about Robert Oppenheimer, obviously, but I did not know that it would be a movie that was kind of the middle of the movie. Part of the climax was the release of the bomb, but that didn't feel like the most important part to the story. What felt like the most important part of the story was what happened after the dropping of the bomb and the messed up, imperfect life of Robert Oppenheimer. In the beginning, you kind of see this man who you don't really know where he stands. At least I kind of felt as though he was a character who wasn't particularly super well developed, and let me expand on that. I didn't in the earlier parts of the movie, he's kind of in college, and you can see that he's a very smart student. They talk about the story in which he learns Dutch, I think, in 6 weeks. Um, but I felt as though some of that stuff wasn't really playing out as well as when later in the movie, I felt like it didn't really serve a purpose. I would have loved to see him right at the end of his time in college when he meets Werner Heisenberg. And then he comes back to the United States. I didn't really need to see that story about him poisoning the apple. I mean, it was a cool story and it's a true story. Um, but with that being said, he's still, as in Christopher Nolan, still put that in the movie when I don't really think that it added too much to the picture. Maybe add a little bit to what you would think of as the character of Oppenheimer. But in terms of the overall story, I don't know how big of a factor it actually played. Other thoughts were obviously the The actual visual effects or lack thereof of CGI, I thought was really, really cool. It was cool to watch a movie and know none of this is computer generated. Seeing the bomb go off, that was actually it was obviously not a real nuclear bomb, but it was a massive bomb that they actually exploded and then took subsequent video of. And I thought that that was really cool to actually include into the movie. That was a nice effect. And now, when it comes to this particular director, Christopher Nolan, he doesn't like to use CGI. So that's part of the reason why he did it. And I thought that they handled that super, super, super cool aspect of the movie. Now, let's move on to kind of speaking about the movie in itself. You'll see here, here's the plot. In 1926, the 22-year-old doctoral student J. Robert Oppenheimer suffers from homesickness and anxiety while studying under experimental physicist Patrick Blackett at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge. Upset with Blackett, Oppenheimer retaliates by leaving him a poison apple, then narrowly prevents visiting scientist Niels Bohr from eating it, which in reality did not happen. Oppenheimer completes his, in terms of the Niels Bohr eating it. Oppenheimer completes his PhD in physics at the University of Göttingen in Germany, and that's where he meets theoretical physicist Werner Heisenberg. He returns to the United States, hoping to expand quantum physics research there, and begins teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, and the California Institute of Technology. He meets his future wife, Catherine Puning, a biologist and ex-communist. He also has an intermittent affair with Jean Tatlock, a member of the Communist Party USA, until her suicide a few years later. In 1942, U.S. Army General Leslie Groves recruits Oppenheimer to lead the Manhattan Project to develop an atomic bomb. After Oppenheimer assures him he has no communist sympathies, Oppenheimer, who is Jewish, is particularly driven by the Nazis potentially completing their nuclear weapons program that Heisenberg heads. Oppenheimer assembles a scientific team, including Edward Teller and Isidore Isaac Rabi in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to secretly create the bomb. Oppenheimer collaborates with the scientists Enrico Fermi and David L. Hill, and he and Albert Einstein discuss how an atomic bomb risks triggering an unstoppable chain reaction that could destroy the world, which I will touch on a little bit later. After Germany surrenders, several scientists question the bomb's continued importance, even though the war in the Pacific is ongoing. The Trinity test is successfully conducted in just before the Potsdam Conference. President Harry S. Truman orders the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender and thrusting Oppenheimer into the public eye as the, quote, father of the atomic bomb. Haunted by the immense destruction and loss of life, Oppenheimer urges Truman to restrict nuclear weapon development. The president disregards Oppenheimer's advice, considering it weak. As an advisor to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, Oppenheimer advocates against further nuclear research, especially the hydrogen bomb proposed by Edward Teller. His stance became a point of contention amid the tense Cold War with the Soviet Union. AEC chairman Lewis Strauss resents Oppenheimer for publicly dismissing his concerns regarding the export of radioisotopes and for recommending arms talks with the Soviet Union. He also believes Oppenheimer turned Einstein against him. At a hearing intending to eliminate his political influence, Oppenheimer is betrayed by Teller and other colleagues. Strauss exploits Oppenheimer's association with communists such as Tatlock and Oppenheimer's brother, Frank. Despite Rabi and several other allies testifying in Oppenheimer's defense, Oppenheimer's security clearance is prematurely revoked, damning damaging his public image and neutralizing his policy influence. At Strauss's later Senate confirmation hearing to become the Secretary of Commerce, Hill testifies about Strauss's personal motives in engineering Oppenheimer's downfall. The Senate votes against Strauss's nomination. In 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson presents Oppenheimer with the Enrico Fermi Award as a gesture of political rehabilitation. Oppenheimer and Einstein's earlier conversation was not about Strauss, but the far-reaching implication of nuclear weapons. Oppenheimer believes he started a chain reaction that will destroy the world. All right. So with that in mind, multiple different kind of things to kind of talk on. First, I'll talk on the leading up to the creation of the bomb was one of the more interesting parts of the movie because one of the things I don't really understand is the actual process of building the bomb. I know kind of how a pistol or a rifle works, how you fire around from there, where you have the gunpowder and you have the tip or the bullet that actually flies out, and then you have the shell casing that comes out of the gun. I kind of know how that works, but I'm not too familiar with how an actual atomic bomb works, especially the physics that surround it. Um, but with that being said, I thought that this movie did a fairly good job of when Oppenheimer was at uh Cal Berkeley, the beginning stages of them putting together the theoretical ways that they could create this bomb. Now, in reality, I do not know if Oppenheimer was as eager to create the bomb as it looked like he was in the movie. However, because of the influence of particularly Nazi Germany and how much power that they had at the time, now it was nearing the end of the war when we're talking about 1942. Uh, Hitler, by the time that the nuclear bomb is actually first tested, Nazi Germany is not being run by Hitler anymore. He has committed suicide or has left the country. And their concern is not that Germany is going to drop a nuke on the entire world. They're more concerned with, okay, let's build this thing so that we know. I felt like there was two different sides of it. You had the military side with Leslie Groves, U.S. Army general, saying we have to build this so that we can end the war. And the scientists, such as Oppenheimer, were building this to say, is this actually possible that we can discover and manipulate the atom to do these kinds of things? And ultimately, the scientists were successful, as was military, especially the US military was successful in utilizing this. You're able to see throughout the movie kind of where things fall fall apart for Oppenheimer. They mostly focus on the downfall being Oppenheimer's left wing and progressive ideas, and how at at Cal Berkeley he would have these things for like unions, and he would pass out flyers and stuff like that, and he would hold lectures talking about his political beliefs, and you see another professor coming up to him and saying, hey, I don't think that's a good idea. Not because he disagrees with him, which he does, but because he's worried that Oppenheimer will be retaliated against. And ultimately, he was because of said beliefs. Now, the movie does a good job of not really, I wouldn't say kind of explaining his views, but a good way of portraying it, where you see that Oppenheimer in those hearings, in those closed room hearings, he kind of goes back and it shows you kind of he gets himself tied up because he says, actually, no, I'm I'm not a I'm not a socialist, I'm not a communist. And they say, well, your brother is. And he's like, yeah, he is. Well, your wife is. Yeah, she was. Yeah, your girlfriend was. Yeah, she was. So, and you also argue for a lot of these policies. Yes, I do. So that means that you are. Well, no. That was kind of the energy that I kind of heard coming from those particular people. And I thought that those were actually one of the best, those closed door hearings where he's has his former colleagues come in and some who stab him in the back and say, I they ask, do you think Oppenheimer should be trusted with security clearance, or do you worry that he has ties to the Communist Party? And Teller says, I do not trust him. And the reason for this, as illustrated by the movie, is because every time Teller brought up the hydrogen bomb and saying, I think we could create a hydrogen bomb and it can make even more power than just a regular plutonium uranium 235. And by doing so, by Oppenheimer shutting his idea down, Teller never got over that fact. He was always mad about that because he wanted to create that. And then later on, he goes and he stabs Oppenheimer in the back. And obviously, this board is going to be on the side of, yeah, screw Oppenheimer. So they bring in Leslie Groves, and he has a great thing played by Matt Damon. I thought he did a fantastic job as Leslie Groves, even though he didn't really look too much like the real guy. It's still Matt Damon. He's super, super talented. And you kind of see they bring him in and they ask, do you think, given the new circumstances and new guidelines for having somebody on the Manhattan Project or on a project, do you think by these current standards that you would have had allowed Oppenheimer to be a part of the Manhattan Project? And he says, you know what, sir? With these new guidelines, I don't think I would have had anybody on the project, which is funny to think about just the how much things change in the matter of a few years. But overall, I really thought that the movie was interesting. I thought the cinematography was fantastic. The picture, even though we didn't see it in IMAX, it was still amazing. I really, really enjoyed it, and I think it's worth a watch. And I really thought that a lot of these actors give them a lot of credit. Josh Peck was in it. I mean, I'm not gonna act like I know who all of these people are, but a lot of people were very, very good. And I thought the movie did a pretty good job as as showing who Oppenheimer was. Now, this is based on a 2005 biography of American Prometheus by Kai Baird and Martin J. Sherwin. So that's what this movie is based on. And there have been multiple interviews of Christopher Nolan kind of talking about this such thing. But if I were to give the movie, I'll give the movie out of 5 stars and I'll give it out of 10. Or I'll give it a letter grade and I'll give it out of 5 stars. So I would say it's probably a 4-star movie. I did feel like the storyline was kind of hard to follow in some places, and there were some aspects of Oppenheimer's story that I felt weren't needed, and I would have preferred personally preferred more of the actual creation of the bomb. And I would have actually loved to have seen a some kind of scene where they're actually dropping the bomb on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Like if they could have incorporated some kind of scene of that, I felt like that would have been really cool because that would have really hammered in the point of just how powerful these bombs were. Keyword is were, which I will talk about later. But I thought that overall, 4 out of 5 movie. If I were to give it a letter grade, I would say it's either an A minus or a no, I would say just an A minus. I would say just an A minus. I wouldn't put it as a B plus. I'd say an A minus because some parts of the story were not super tantalizing and super pulling you in and super crazy like that. But I thought that the cinematography, I thought it looked beautiful. I really, really enjoyed the movie, and I think you should give it a try and go watch it and kind of keep an open mind as to who this Robert Oppenheimer was. Because there is a lot of different factors that went into the creation of this bomb, the deployment of the bomb, and also the actions that were taken after the bomb. With that being said, I want to take a moment and let's listen to what Robert Oppenheimer himself had to say about the dropping of the bomb before I make my comments about the dropping of the actual bomb.
Looking back now, do you think that our country's use of the bomb was necessary?
I believe that the view which I learned from many, but above all from General Marshall and from Colonel Stimson, the Secretary of War, the view that they had that we would have to fight our way to the main islands, and that it would involve a slaughter of Americans and Japanese on a massive scale, was arrived at by them in good faith, with regret, and on the best evidence that they then had.
So basically what he's kind of saying there and how this relates back to the movie is the worry was okay, either we drop these bombs, specifically two, because they felt as though one would not have shown that they were actually serious. If they had two, that means that they have more than one. If they just drop one, it's like, okay, you just have one. Okay, do you have any more? But if you drop two, it gives you, hey, we can make more of these and also differing in power. And we can also drop them anywhere we want without you doing anything about it. So, with that being said, the actual creation and the decision behind dropping the bomb was a difficult one because the military people were saying, hey, if we don't drop this, we're going to have to invade Japan. We're going to have to go into Japan and we're going to have to see kind of what exactly, or they're going to have to invade, I should say, excuse me. And with that invasion, there could be thousands, if not tens and hundreds of thousands more casualties of Americans. And it doesn't guarantee the end of the war. The people in the United States government, especially the Department of War, as it was called, particularly was more concerned with trying to end the war as quick as possible with the least amount of American casualties. And this is something that I will talk about more, and actually something that I had a discussion with ChatGPT about. And you'll actually be able to kind of get an understanding from both sides of the argument, pros and cons. But I hope that we can listen to Oppenheimer himself give more of his reasoning behind the entire situation that he himself is embroiled in.
To that alternative, I think the bomb was an enormous relief. The war had started in 1939. It's seen the death of tens of millions. It's seen brutality and degradation, which had no place in the middle of the 20th century. The ending of the war by this means, certainly cruel, was not undertaken lightly. But I am not, as of today, confident that a better course was then open. I have not a very good answer to this.
I think one of the things that the movie did really well was kind of show the I wouldn't call it shame, but the kind of ugliness that Oppenheimer felt, like the kind of guilt that he felt after the dropping. Because you could tell the second that the last piece was put in place and that red button was hit, the second after that, Oppenheimer lost all of his power. The government came in, particularly in the military, and said, okay, let's get this thing produced, make another one, and then make another one, and thank you for your service. Screw you, we're out of here. That was kind of the immediate aftermath of the Trinity test. And I think Oppenheimer, for good reason, held a lot of grudges because of that, because he's the one who created it, and he felt as though he should have a say in the deployment and ultimate death of tens of thousands, close to hundreds of thousands of people. And it's not an easy answer. You ask probably our current president, should they have dropped the bomb? Most people in America would probably say yes, especially if you're a World War II veteran. The horrors that you saw on the front lines, watching your friends getting butchered, untold families torn apart because their brother, cousin, son, husband, even wife, daughter was killed in action because they went to a different part of the world thinking that they would come home, but just one day they zigged when they should have zagged, as they say. And would another invasion had resulted in another person from, hell, even a city like Pittsburgh, another person dying needlessly just so that we can win this war? Or is it better to actually create a device that guarantees there's no mutual combat? And there is a 0% chance that any American soldiers, unless the plane gets shot down, which is unlikely, but that any American soldiers will get killed in the process. And America's stance was, I don't want to have more American soldiers die, which I can understand. However, to actually drop the bomb is a different story. There are different ways to think about this, and there's not a right or wrong answer. There's a mix. And I can't sit here and say that if I was in that position, especially in 1940, in the 1940s, that I would have made a different decision if I was Harry Truman. Would I have called for an invasion instead of dropping the bomb, even though this technology was getting created in other parts around the world and I knew other countries were eventually going to get this technology, possibly other countries such as Germany, Russia, Great Britain, places where can you trust them not to drop it on you? I don't know. I don't know if I can answer that question. I wasn't in those rooms when they were making these decisions. But this is one of those things where it weighs on you because not only are you killing civilians, but you're killing mothers, babies, children, dogs, cats, fish, and then leaving destructive radiation for decades. Well, what is the alternative? Do the Americans and the American government have an actual argument?
Dr. Oppenheimer, nevertheless, with all the rationalization, with all the inevitability of the decision that history demonstrates to us, you and many like you who brought the bomb into being still seem to suffer, may I say, from a bad conscience about it. Is that true, sir?
Uh, well, I don't want to speak for others because we're all different. Uh, I I think when you play a meaningful part in bringing about the death of over 100,000 people and the injury of a comparable number, you naturally don't think of that as with ease. I believe we had a great cause to do this, but I do not think that our consciences should be entirely easy at stepping out of the part of studying nature, learning the truth about it, to change the course of human history. Long ago, I said once that in a crude sense, which no vulgarity and no humor could quite erase, the physicists had known sin. And I didn't mean by that the deaths that were caused as the result of our work. I meant that we had known the sin of pride. We had turned to effect in what proved to be a major way the course of man's history. We had the pride of thinking we knew what was good for men. And I do think it has left a mark on many of those who were responsibly engaged.
Imagine you are a physicist in Germany, a man of Jewish descent, Jewish faith. You flee because the Nazis take over and they are slaughtering your people. You come to America, come to California. Beautiful, beautiful area. You're at a prestigious university. And you're a genius, may I say? What exactly is the steps that it takes to get to this particular point? At what point did Robert Oppenheimer actually become, I think you could make the argument, become a mass murderer? I don't not mincing words, he was a mass murderer by default because his creation led to thousands of deaths. And give him credit because he is admitting his conscience is not clear, nor should it be. I don't think this is an overly positive story of triumph and great scientific achievement and it's all good and there's no cons. No. The cons in this one are in the tens of thousands. Family trees and generations of people wiped out forever. There is no way around this. It's overall not a perfect situation. And in this particular interview from 1965, Oppenheimer, I think he does a good job of expressing not only his involvement in it and the kind of pride that he had with the creation of this device, but also the sorrow, or even a little bit of it, even a little bit of empathy or sympathy for the people who he ultimately helped in the demise of.
This is not the natural business of a scientist.
You know, in the first days after Hiroshima, you pointed out that scientists who built the bomb had nurtured the hope, really, that nuclear weapons, as you put it, would lead to new patterns of behavior. Well, why has that hope failed of realization?
Well, look, I think I may have said that then. I think I wrote it recently. I said two things: new patterns of behavior and new institutions. I think that when you remember the manifest causes of conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, which have bedeviled us for 20 years, and which are by no means in any conventional sense solved, when you remember the ideological ferocity that animated the post-war communists that we see now in the Chinese unmuted form, you think of the anti-communist ferocity with which we met this, the notion that there is a telephone communication between the White House and the Kremlin to make sure that there are no misunderstandings is a damn new pattern of behavior. I think it's something that almost without precedent in wars in conflicts which have such a total character as that between the communists and the free world has tended to have. I think the notion that the United States should be fixing up its power to fight limited engagements on the ground and in the air with old-fashioned weapons that we hope are a little better than they used to be, not as a step in conquering the world, but as a step in giving a chance to think, to pause, to argue, and to persuade before a holocaust. That's a pattern that I believe is not familiar either.
Does the possession of a nuclear bomb actually deter conflict between countries? And I think a pretty good example is currently what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. A conflict in which I wish that a peace can be established as soon as humanly possible. Something I've talked about on the show before, but I will reiterate. I believe that both sides should negotiate a peace deal and stop the fighting. Both sides give up concessions. You don't need innocent on both sides. Don't need people to be dying. It's 2023, halfway through the year. Over halfway through the year. This isn't good for our planet. This fighting, this indiscriminate killing is not good for our species. And it does not bode well for us long term. You have family trees of people where maybe somebody in their bloodline could help launch our civilization forward in ways that we can't think of right now. But because their parents or great grandparents or somebody in their lineage was X'd out, they're not able to live. I hope that it is increasingly becoming, or I should say, we are increasingly becoming more and more aware of the dilemma that surrounds the creation of not only nuclear devices, but the testing and the ultimate use. And as I poised earlier, is there a deterrence for a country to have nuclear weapons? I would say yeah. Because you don't know if they're going to use them. And like I'll talk about later, the nuclear bombs that we have now are thousands of times more powerful than the ones that we have already dropped. And there's only been 2 that have been used on other people. The rest have just been tests. And yes, there has been some tests that have resulted in human impact. That was not the point of them. I do hope that there can be both sides to this argument, because I think there are more than one sides to this argument. And unfortunately, like I say many times on this podcast, I'm recording in an empty apartment. There's nobody here. It's nobody that can say, actually, I think you're not right on this. And I do hope that if I am wrong about something, I am corrected. Because I believe that, especially with a topic like this, I want to give as much respect to all people that were involved. The decision to ultimately drop these bombs was a hard decision that I'm glad I didn't have to make. Because I don't know if I would have made a different decision. With that being said, I do want to talk about some things that I asked ChatGPT to kind of talk about this subject. And then I'm going to play some videos that I got from Instagram and TikTok to kind of show different people their own perspective. Or to, people who talk about their own perspective. And I have a varying array of different perspectives, particularly. But first, let's go to ChatGPT. I asked ChatGPT, what are the pros and cons of the United States government dropping the atomic bombs on Japan? Here's the response. The decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan during World War II was a complex and contentious one, with both pros and cons associated with it. Here are some of the arguments. For the pros, 1, expedited end of the war. The primary justification for using the atomic bombs was to bring a swift end to the war. It is argued that dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki led to Japan's surrender, thus saving countless lives that would have been lost in a prolonged war. 2, deterrence. The use of the atomic bombs demonstrated the immense destructive power of nuclear weapons, potentially deterring future conflicts and encouraging nuclear disarmament after the war. 3. Strategic considerations. The bombings were seen as a strategic move to avoid a costly and protracted invasion of Japan, known as Operation Downfall, which could have resulted in even more casualties on both sides. 4. Protecting American lives. By bringing the war to a swift conclusion, the bombings were perceived as protecting the lives of American soldiers who would have been involved in the invasion of Japan. Cons. 1. Humanitarian concerns. The bombings resulted in massive civilian casualties and widespread destruction, raising significant moral and humanitarian concerns. Many argue that the bombings constituted an inhumane act of indiscriminate violence. 2. Limited military value. Some critics argue that Japan was already on the verge of surrender due to various factors, such as the Soviet Union's entry into the war and the blockade of Japan, making the bombings unnecessary to secure Japan's surrender. Escalation of nuclear arms race. Number 3. The use of atomic bombs set a precedent for the use of nuclear weapons in warfare and triggered an arms race, leading to the proliferation of nuclear weapons among other countries. 4. Long-term health effects. The bombings caused severe radiation exposure to survivors and led to long-term health consequences, including increased risk of cancers and other diseases. In conclusion, the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan remains a subject of debate to this day. The bombings undoubtedly had a profound impact on ending the war and shaping the course of history, but they also raised serious ethical, humanitarian, and geopolitical concerns. It is essential to remember this historical event and use it as a reminder to the devastating consequences of warfare and the importance of promoting peace and disarmament. A couple things in here that I do want to talk about that are mentioned not only in the Oppenheimer movie, but also by Oppenheimer himself. Protecting American lives for the pros, expedited end of the war. Right? You drop the bomb. Japan says, oh shit, they mean business, right? While that may be true, if you look at the cons, it appears that Japan was already kind of nearing towards the end, and it wasn't really particularly as if it couldn't have been a wait and see thing. Did they need to drop the bombs at that point? Or strategically, like one of the pros is, it could have been a deterrence to see these are what these bombs can do, and we need to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Well, I mean, maybe that doesn't mean that you do it in the first place, correct? But with that being said, there is no real answer to this. And one of the things that it ultimately did do that I don't think that the United States government was thinking about at the time, although maybe I'm wrong about that, because in the movie, in Oppenheimer, they talk about and they discuss how all these other countries are building the bomb. They're also getting there. They also have the best scientists. And even before the creation, it was kind of an arms race to see who could build the bomb first. And you see the excitement in all their faces when they are informed that Germany made a wrong turn. And so their research is ultimately not going to come to the same conclusion as the Americans, which ultimately allowed for the Americans to create the bomb faster than the Germans. But it is a hard question to answer. And so I asked ChatGPT, what did Harry Truman believe of the bombings? Here's ChatGPT's response. As President Truman, I made the difficult decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan to expedite the end of the war and save countless American lives. The bombings were necessary to show the world the overwhelming power of nuclear weapons and deter future conflicts. While I understood the humanitarian concerns, I believe that ending the war swiftly and avoiding a costly invasion of Japan was the most responsible course of action. The bombings marked a turning point in history, leading to the eventual disarmament discussions and shaping the world order. As challenging as the decision was, I stand by it, considering the context of the time and paramount goal of securing a lasting peace. My next question was, what did Emperor Showa think of the atomic bombings? Did he have any comments? What arguments did he make against the bombings? Now, Emperor Showa, known as Emperor Hirohito, was the leader of Japan at this time. Here is ChatGPT's response. Emperor Showa, known as Emperor Hirohito, did not publicly express his thoughts or make any comments about the atomic bombings during World War II or immediately after Japan's surrender. As a constitutional monarch, he held a symbolic and ceremonial role in Japanese societies, and his official statements were typically limited to matters of state and national ceremonies. After Japan's surrender in 1945, Emperor Hirohito made a recorded radio broadcast to the nation known as the Jewel Voice Broadcast, announcing Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and the end of the war. In this speech, he did not comment on the specific events of the atomic bombings, but expressed a desire for peace and urged his people to endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable. It is worth noting that Emperor Hirohito's role during the World War II and his levels of involvement in Japan's military decisions have been subjects of historical debate. Some argue that he has held significant influence over the government and military decisions, while others maintain that he had limited power and was largely a figurehead. As for arguments against the bombings, Emperor Hirohito's specific views are not on record. However, it is known that some Japanese officials and military leaders opposed surrender even after the bombings, clinging to the notion of fighting to the last man to preserve Japanese honor. Nevertheless, with the reality of two devastating atomic bombings and the Soviet Union declaration of war against Japan, the country's leadership eventually recognized the need to surrender to prevent further destruction and loss of life. My next question to ChatGPT was, what happened after the bombs? What was the timeline? Because this is the 1940s. This is not 2023 where we have instant communication with the masses. There was no Twitter. There was no large-scale TV broadcast even. There was no Fox News, MSNBC, CBS. There was none of that. So I asked for a rundown that events that happened after the first atomic bomb was dropped. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay, a U.S. B-29 bomber, dropped the first atomic bomb named Little Boyd on Hiroshima, Japan. The bomb exploded at approximately 8:15 a.m. local time. In the immediate aftermath, the explosion instantly killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people and caused extensive damage to buildings and infrastructure within a radius of about 1 mile from the hypocenter. On August 8th, 2 days after, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched an invasion of Manchuria and other Japanese-held territories in the region. On August 9th, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb named Fat Man on Nagasaki, Japan. The bomb caused widespread destruction and resulted in an estimated 40,000 immediate deaths. 6 days later, on August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation in a recorded radio broadcast, announcing Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, effectively surrendering and bringing an end to World War II. On September 2nd, 1945, so a couple weeks after, the formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, with General Douglas MacArthur accepting Japan's unconditional surrender on behalf of the Allied powers. 1945 to 1952, the Allied occupation of Japan began, led by the United States and Emperor Hirohito. retained his position as a constitutional monarch under the new Japanese government. Right post-war reconstruction. In the aftermath of the bombings, Japan faced significant challenges in rebuilding its city and economy. The country experienced a period of reconstruction and economic growth, transforming itself into a modern industrialized nation. Next, the nuclear arms race. The use of atomic bombs marked the beginning of the nuclear arms race during the Cold War era, with the United States and the Soviet Union escalating their nuclear capabilities. Long-term health effects. The survivors of the atomic bombings, known as Hibakusha, experienced long-term health consequences, including increased rates of cancer and other disease due to radiation exposure. All right, and then I also asked it to go from 1952 to 2000, because remember, this is all 1945 to 1952. The Allied occupation of Japan began, led by U.S. and all that reconstruction after that, the arms race, the Cold War, obviously. All right. 1952. Japan regained its sovereignty as the Allied occupation officially ended with the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. The country began to focus on rebuilding its economy and strengthening its international relationships. In 1954, the Lucky Dragon 5 incident occurred when a Japanese fishing boat was exposed to radioactive fallout from a U.S. hydrogen bomb test in the Marshall Islands. The incident heightened anti-nuclear sentiment in Japan and led to increased opposition to nuclear weapons. In 1955, Japan officially joined the United Nations, marking a significant step in its return to the international community as a peaceful nation. So 10 years after. 1960, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was signed, allowing the United States to maintain military bases in Japan. The treaty sparked protests and debate over Japan's sovereignty and security policies. 4 years later, in 1964, Tokyo hosted the Summer Olympics, symbolizing Japan's post-war recovery and emergence as an economic powerhouse. In 1970, Japan and China reestablished diplomatic relations after nearly 3 decades of estrangement, marking a significant step in Japan's efforts to mend ties with its Asian neighbors. 3 years later, in 1973, the first oil crisis hit Japan, exposing its reliance on energy imports and prompting the government to pursue energy conservation and diversification strategies. In the 1980s, Japan experienced a period of rapid economic growth and became one of the world's leading economies, often referred to as the Japanese economic miracle. In 1990, Japan's economic bubble burst, leading to a prolonged period of economic stagnation known as the Lost Decade. The country faced challenges in dealing with deflation and restructuring its economy. In 1955, the Great Hanshin earthquake struck Kobe, which caused significant damage and loss of life. The disaster highlighted the need for improved disaster preparedness and infrastructure resilience. In 1997, Japan's Prime Minister Ryutaro Hashimoto issued an official apology for the country's actions during World War II, expressing remorse and regret for the suffering caused by Japan's militarism. In 1998, Japan launched the Zarya module, its first contribution to the International Space Station, showcasing the country's technological prowess and commitment to international scientific cooperation. In 2000, Japan participated in the Millennium Summit at the United Nations, reaffirming its commitment to global peace, sustaining development, and international cooperation. Interesting stuff. It is kind of to talk about this, because I am not the best person to talk about this subject, but I think it's an important thing to talk about, even though I'm not going to have the best take on it. I'm not going to have the best take on Oppenheimer. I'm not a movie reviewer. I just thought the movie was good. And I also don't have the best analysis of the different forces at play when it comes to World War II and the ultimate dropping of the bombs. But what I am confident in is my ability to kind of understand the impact and just the loss of life that wasn't just lost in these particular bombings, but all of World War II. And I hope that there is no World War III. I hope that the fighting between countries can stop, and I hope that the people in the highest positions of power are able to understand that this is it. This is the only planet that we got. We're not going to another place for a long time. And if we're going to destroy this beautiful planet that has over billions of years allowed for us to exist on it, if we're going to destroy it with hydrogen bombs, then maybe we didn't deserve it in the first place. The next thing I kind of wanted to talk about was some things. There was some things that I wanted to show you, particularly when it comes to the movie. There's this particular thing that I wanted. All right. I got a whole bunch of clips. We're going to start off with this. This is kind of a review of the movie Oppenheimer and kind of the more scientific backings behind it. So let's take a listen. There's no way to make this full screen, is there? Yes, there is. Yes, there is. All right, here we go.
Did you know that the US nearly assassinated Heisenberg, like the uncertainty principle Heisenberg? Here's a brief history of the atomic bomb to get you ready for Oppenheimer. Now, Oppenheimer is often referred to as the man who made the bomb, or like the father of the atomic bomb. And sure, he was director of Los Alamos Lab, he had a huge influence, but he wasn't alone, and he didn't come up with the idea. So to understand this, we have to go back to the origin. Now, let's start in Germany, Berlin, December 1938. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered nuclear fission. They found that if they hit uranium with neutrons, it split, releasing a lot of energy, 1 billion times more energy than any chemical reaction. Not only this, but the splitting released more neutrons, which then could result in a chain reaction. So more and more uranium being split, more and more energy being released. Initially, it was thought that this could be useful for like providing energy or used in medicine or something. But nobody was really paying too much attention because not all isotopes of uranium are fissile. Basically, 99% of the uranium isotopes are uranium-238, which cannot sustain a nuclear chain reaction. The isotope that could is uranium-235, and this isotope was rare. There were only like small amounts available for lab experiments, but nothing that could allow for like a large energy production. But in 1939 in Britain, Otto Frisch and Rudolf Pearl started to think, well, what if you could isolate uranium-235? They realized pretty quickly the implications of this on weapons and were so concerned that they wrote a memo about a potential super bomb, urging the British government to look into nuclear research, because fission had been discovered in Germany. And so as the science news was spreading across the globe and people started to understand what it could mean, many were convinced that, well, Germany must already be working on a new weapon using this idea. So in 1939, the UK set up the Tube Alloys Project, codename of course. Meanwhile, across the pond, the same fears and concerns were taking hold with a group of prominent scientists, most notably Albert Einstein, who signed a letter to President Roosevelt urging him to begin a research program. Now, Einstein would later say that this was the great mistake of his life. Roosevelt, though, took the letter to heart and budgeted $6,000 for research into how to isolate uranium-235. And while progress was made, it wasn't until 1942 when it was moved to the US Army Corps of Engineer Research and under the direction of Leslie Groves that the project really started to become one of the most ambitious ones in history. Now, Groves is then the one who appointed Oppenheimer as the director of the Los Alamos Lab. This was the research facility where the bombs were to be built. Meanwhile, in Germany, in 1939, just a few months after Hahn and Strassmann's fission discovery, the Uran-Varen project was set up, Uranium Club. Now, this project had a significant head start on the Manhattan Project and was led by none other than Werner Heisenberg. Heisenberg principle, winner of the Nobel Prize for the creation of quantum mechanics. In fact, the US were so threatened by Heisenberg that when he was set to give a talk in Switzerland, they contemplated kidnapping him. Well, some people thought they should kidnap him. Groves was prepared to kidnap or assassinate him. And he actually sent an OSS agent to Switzerland to follow Heisenberg around, but in the end decided not to go ahead with the assassination. Now, during all this time, the Soviet Union had set up their secret site called Arzama 16, led by Igor Kurchatov. And despite having spies in the Manhattan Project feeding them information, they were unable to get a bomb built until 1949, but they did, of course, achieve it, which had implications later for the Cold War. Now, despite having a head start, the German project never went very far, and Heisenberg himself didn't even believe that the US had actually done it when he first heard of the bombing of Nagasaki. Because the biggest issue in the race to build a bomb was isolating enough uranium. And Germany just could not match the scope of the Manhattan Project. There were three main sites: Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, where they developed enriched uranium, and Hanford, where they built reactors for plutonium. By 1943, the British Tube Alloys Project had been absorbed into the Manhattan Project, and there were significant contributions coming from Canada as well. Overall, up to 130,000 people, not to mention hundreds of the world's best physicists, chemists, engineers, were all working on this project together across the US. Now, construction on the production sites began in 1943, and 27 months later, they had built the world's first atomic bomb. The main driving force was always, what if the enemy builds it first? Now, a great satirical example of game theory driving the world towards self-destruction is Stanley Kubrick's movie Dr. Strangelove. But this isn't satire. It was a time filled with fear, and while most of the scientists involved would later feel that they brought evil into the world, at the time they were doing it, they felt it was a necessary evil. And as Rudolf Pearl said, once fission had been discovered, you couldn't undiscover it. I'm Abby, I'm an atomic physicist, and I'm here to answer all your questions about Oppenheimer.
Pop culture scientist. Really good video, and specifically talking about kind of the science, and then also the events leading up to it. I highly suggest you go follow her on all of her accounts, not just TikTok. Go support her, donate to her, give her money on it, do whatever. Be nice, show respect. Anyways, now we're gonna get into a review of Oppenheimer from somebody who knows a little thing or two about world history and also about bombs, and somebody who has a relation with a world leader currently involved in a potential nuclear conflict. This person is Oliver Stone. Here's what he had to say about the movie Oppenheimer that I think are interesting. I sat through 3 hours of Oppenheimer, gripped by Christopher Nolan's narrative. The screenplay is layered and fascinating. Being familiar with the book of Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin, I once turned the project down because I couldn't find my way to its essence. Nolan has found it. His direction is also mind-boggling and eye-popping as he takes reams of incident and cycles it into an exciting torrent of action inside all the talk. Each actor is a surprise to me, especially Cillian Murphy, whose exaggerated eyes here feel normal, playing a genius like Oppenheimer, a classic, which I never would believe would be made in this climate. Bravo. 2 historical points I'd argue. Historian Pete Kuznick and I, in our Untold History of the United States series 2012, made the important distinction that 1. Japan barely knew what hit them on August 6 at Hiroshima. LeMay's Air Force had firebombed 100 Japanese cities, more than 80,000 killed in Tokyo firestorm alone, 1 million homeless and wounded. Japanese leaders accepted that the U.S. could destroy their cities, but they were willing to sacrifice them. And 2, Japan did not surrender, as American propaganda would have it, because of the atomic bomb, but because a few days later, on August 9th, 1.5 million Russian soldiers invaded and destroyed their imperial army in Manchuria. Hokkaido was next. The Japanese leader feared the Russians would give no quarter, removing Japan's beloved emperor, as they did their own czar in their revolution of 1917. The supposed much-hyped U.S. land invasion of Japan could not have even happened, according to our planning, for some 3 months. Given these fast-moving events, there was no way the Japanese mainland, already devastated, short of food and on the point of famine, could have held out that long. Aside from these points, the movie packs in the essence of the tragedy of Oppenheimer, a man historically in the middle of an impossible situation, though one, as Nolan shows, partly of his own making. Interesting point. And now we're going to kind of get into more people who I think it's important to hear what they say. And you make the decision whether you believe they're right or wrong. I'm also going to do the same as well. This is Physique.
J. Robert Oppenheimer and all of his colleagues are burning in hell forever. They're some of the most.
Also, I do want to point out language warning as well, I believe, in this video.
J. Robert Oppenheimer and all of his colleagues are burning in hell forever. They're some of the most evil people of that war. On par with the Soviets that massacred millions of people, they are the most evil people for that era and the eras following. They wanted to use certain radioactive isotopes to poison the food of 500,000 people. In a declassified letter from 1943, he's writing to Edward Teller, another Manhattan Project physicist, and he talked about the idea of using strontium-90 to poison the water supply in Europe. This was May 23rd, 1943. He also wrote a letter to Enrico Fermi saying that we should delay further work on the nuclear bomb so we can poison food sufficient to kill 500,000 men. One of his colleagues, Theodor Alvin Holzberg, was essential for the Soviet Union creating their nuclear program, and he was aware of their development of the nuclear bomb. In the same era as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg stealing American secrets and giving it to the Soviets, Theodor Alvin Holzberg got in touch with his old college roommate, Saville Sachs, a communist, and he gave a bunch of information on the development of the nuclear bomb to the Soviets through him. There's also Klaus Fuchs, a Manhattan Project scientist who was personally present at the Trinity site testing. He provided a lot of information to the Soviet Union. These rat bastards betrayed their country and helped to set up for the Cold War, almost causing the end of humanity. These Manhattan Project scientists, these physicists that you see in the movie, they're not just noble men devoted to science that are torn into a war. These are generally shitty people that wanted to inflict as much destruction as possible. They wanted to kill as many people in Europe as possible. Specifically, they wanted to kill a lot of the German population. Hans Bethe, Otto Frisch, John von Neumann, James Frank, Edward Teller, Klaus Fuchs, Rudolf Perls, Eugene Wigner, and even Enrico Fermi. And yeah, J. Robert Oppenheimer. He might have opposed America's development of the hydrogen bomb, but he allowed the Soviet Union to develop their own nuclear weapons. He was well aware of the shit going on with his colleagues giving information to the Soviet Union. Spending your entire life crying about, oh, I contributed to 500,000 dead. Do you think J. Robert Oppenheimer and the other physicists, many of whom were communists, cared about the United States involving itself in Operation Downfall in Japan? They wanted to drop the bomb on Germany. Just like the United States had already been attacking civilian centers, and the United Kingdom had already been attacking civilian centers, see the Dresden bombings, 140,000 dead. They wanted to drop the nuclear bomb on Berlin, but they were out of the war. So, we have to drop it on Japan. Oh, this is so sad. I regret my actions so badly. These men sided not only with an ideology, but with a nation that killed 30 million people, raped 2.3 million German women, 100,000 in Berlin alone, contributed to the deaths of 9 million German civilians after the war. They didn't give a fuck about killing people. These people are burning in hell as we speak. Going to see a movie about them is corny as fuck. Oh, it's so sad. Dude, lol, Harry Truman really, told them, bro, who cares? They're pieces of shit and they are burning in hell forever.
What do you think? There are so many different ways, and I understand. I get it. Pieces of garbage. And I am not an expert on this topic whatsoever, but those people are. And there's many different views and angles to look at this, and kind of I guess one of my points is war, particularly, is something that's not easy. And a lot of times we think that there is only one solution. And many times, I think there is. I think we should be peaceful with everybody. But in all situations, I don't know if I can keep that same energy. And although the creation of the atomic bomb costed thousands, if not millions of people's their lives, so did the entirety of World War II. We're talking tens of millions died in World War II. And as Physique just mentioned, they wanted to drop this bomb on Nazi Germany. But Germany was already out of the war. They had already created the bomb. So why not drop it on Japan? And as he says, these folks are burning in hell. Now, I can neither confirm nor deny that point, but I think it's an important thing to discuss. Anyways, moving on. I'm going to talk about kind of atomic bombs. Like the next section is going to be specifically more so about atomic bombs and atomic bomb testing. So to kind of wrap up Oppenheimer, good movie, but I don't know if he's a good man. Robert Oppenheimer had a very long and confusing history. And I felt as though this movie did a good job of expressing some of the real Oppenheimer. You see his relationship problems, his problems as a father, as a husband, as a friend. You see, he's not a perfect man. And back in 1942, 1943, 1944, 1945, there probably weren't that many. Not to say that there are more now today, but when you have World War II going on, and I know people who were around during that time. My own grandmother, rest in peace. Stories about being in the Navy. I'm from Connecticut. I know about the Navy. I know about those shipyards. I know where they would send those people off. I'm not an expert on it, but I've seen where these historical sites have taken place where they would take hundreds, if not thousands, of 18, 19, 20-year-olds and ship them off to Japan, ship them off to Asia to never see their family again. And now, as I've mentioned, there are maybe about two sides to this story. Should they have dropped the bomb or should they have not dropped the bomb? And I hope I've provided a good overall image of the harsh realities of war and why I think that one of the most powerful things that you can do is show your love and support for people that you may disagree with. I don't think that it was all bad. I also don't think it was all good. I don't think there was a lot of good. I also don't think there was a lot of bad. I think it's just a lot of murk, a lot of mud. It's a lot of different things happening at once. ChatGPT, Harry Truman, he had his reasons. But what's the reality? I'm not sure. Moving on. Atomic bombs. Let's watch some more videos of these kind of talking about atomic bombs. Also, shout out to all of the previous people who I have put on the show. I really hope that they get all the love and support that they deserve. Now, let's move on to Morbid Atomic Bomb Facts by Morbid Archives.
These are some morbid facts about atomic bombs. During a test in 1951, an atomic bomb cameraman accidentally ripped off his safety goggles a few seconds before the bomb exploded. He immediately covered his eyes with his hands, and when the bomb detonated, he saw the bones of his hands through his closed eyelids just like an X-ray. The Soviet Tsar Bomba was the largest bomb ever set off by far. It was 3,500 times stronger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima and sent shockwaves that traveled around the Earth 3 times. In 1961, the U.S. Air Force accidentally dropped 2 nuclear bombs on North Carolina, each 250 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, but luckily neither of them exploded. This map shows how far the radiation could have spread if one of them detonated. Not to mention in 1958, the Air Force dropped a 7,600-pound H-bomb in Savannah, Georgia that remains unfound to this day. In 1964, the U.S. Army performed an experiment to see if 3 young physics students could design an atomic bomb. They had no specific knowledge of nuclear weapons and were only given access to publicly available documents. Within 3 years, they succeeded.
Damn. Talk about a senior project. Creating a nuke in 3 years. All right, here's another video I saw about Australia. Australia.
Hundreds of nuclear weapons were detonated in Australia. Did you know that despite the incredibly destructive capabilities of nuclear weapons, they actually pale in comparison to what we're capable of today? Nuclear weapons are one of the most terrifying and incredible achievements of humankind, and at the end of Oppenheimer, we're left with the suggestion by Oppenheimer himself that the development of these weapons could lead to an arms race. But that's where the movie ends, and we're going to take a look at what really happened, and trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this because this stuff is incredible. As it turns out, Oppenheimer was actually correct. You see, not only did this trigger an arms race between Russia and America, it also triggered an arms race between America and the other allied nations who didn't want America to be the only ones with a nuclear weapon. This included Great Britain, who immediately began developing their own nuclear program, but there was one small problem. See, Britain is very small and very densely populated, so where could they possibly test a really big wait? I know. On the 3rd of October 1952, at 11:15 a.m., Britain detonated their first successful nuclear weapons test on the Montebello Islands off the northwest coast of Australia. This test was 25 kilotons, which is 10 more kilotons than the weapon dropped on Hiroshima. The next major test would occur again on the Montebello Islands, culminating in a 60 kiloton nuclear explosion, 4 times the size of the one dropped at Hiroshima. But no, the Brits weren't done yet. You see, with the success of these tests, they needed to find a permanent firing range, and after moving from a place called Emu Fields, where they conducted 2 tests, they moved to Maralinga. The site in South Australia was chosen for its remoteness, and the traditional owners were rounded up, put on trucks, and shipped off to a part of the country they'd never been to, had no connection to, and left in the bush. Over 500 tests were conducted at Maralinga before it was shut down in 1963. But the thing is, when they shut the site down, they just left it contaminated with radioactive waste laying all over the place, and it actually remained incredibly dangerous for 40 years. While that was the end of the British nuclear testing program, reaching a maximum yield of 60 kilotons, the race between the United States and the Soviets was far from over. The United States went on to conduct 1,032 nuclear tests, with the last occurring in 1992, and the largest, Castle Bravo on the right there, reaching a yield of 15 megatons, which is 1,000 times the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. That's Castle Bravo behind me. Now, this thing carved out a crater that was 6,500 feet wide and 250 feet deep, or for everybody else, 2 kilometers wide and 76 meters deep. Here's what the blast radius from Hiroshima looked like, a bomb that killed 140,000 people. Here's what Castle Bravo would have looked like. This is the blast radius here, and this is the nuclear fallout. Now, this would have killed over 1 million people pretty much instantly and injured another 400,000, and God knows how many over the course of the radioactive decay life. But we're not done yet. This is where it gets truly terrifying. The Soviets conducted 715 tests up until 1990, which culminated in the infamous Tsar Bomba, a thermonuclear bomb to end all wars. The Tsar bomb was dropped by parachute from a plane and detonated at 4,000 meters above the Cape of Savoni Island on the 30th of October 1961. At half of its explosive potential, the Russians removed half because they were afraid of how big it would be. The Tsar bomb generated 58 megatons of nuclear explosive power, which is 4 times that of Castle Bravo and 4,000 times that of Hiroshima. If you take a look here, this tiny little dot on the graph here is Hiroshima, and the Tsar bomb is the big one on the right, even dwarfing the Bravo test. This cloud the explosion generated was 100 kilometers wide at the top and extended up into the stratosphere of the Earth for more than 50 kilometers. Everything within 60 kilometers was instantly vaporized, and at 250 kilometers away, the blast was powerful enough even to level entire cities, and it shattered windows in Finland more than 2,000 kilometers away. This obviously terrified everybody. So 2 years later, in 1963, a nuclear test ban treaty was signed by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. Again, for context, here's Hiroshima. And here's what the Tsar bomb would do if dropped in the same place. This would result in 1.5 million deaths at half yield and 400,000 casualties. Now, you'll notice that the fallout is way less than the Bravo test, and that's because they actually removed the uranium-238 from the Tsar bomb test to reduce the explosive capability and prevent nuclear fallout from drifting to other places in Russia. If you're morbidly curious like I am, this is what the full capability would look like. Here it is at New York. Here it is at London. Here's Paris, Hawaii, and Sydney, Australia. So yeah, Oppenheimer was right. He was more right than anybody would have liked him to be. Now, I'm going to play some footage of the actual Tsar bomb test behind me. And while I'm doing this, I want to leave you with a really, really terrifying thing. Humankind has had the capacity to detonate a bomb twice the size of the Tsar bomb since 1961. We hadn't even discovered DNA in 1961. We hadn't invented barcodes, cell phones, GPS, microchips, or even the internet. In 1954, Edward Teller proposed an allegedly working 10,000 megaton hydrogen bomb that was large enough to destroy the entire United Kingdom and Ireland in an instant. But the most terrifying of all is an antimatter weapon, capable of releasing the same energy as the Nagasaki explosion from just half a gram of matter, or the Tsar bomb from just 1.4 kilos or 3 pounds. For now, antimatter is prohibitively expensive, costing about $69 billion to create 1/millionth of a gram. But that will likely change, and when it does, we may unleash something with a destructive capability beyond imagining. Something that could truly embody Oppenheimer's famous quote, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds."
These bombs get powerful, and the antimatter bomb is a completely different subject, because once you start talking about that and the possibility for that, I just really hope that they don't drop those again, especially on Pittsburgh. Please, please don't. Please. Anyways, more videos on atomic bombs. Here we go. Here's another morbid archives.
Morbid facts so you didn't know about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Part 2. Albert Einstein encouraged President Roosevelt to develop the atomic bomb because he feared that the Nazis would make one first. But he deeply regretted this after hearing about the devastation of Hiroshima, and knowing that his discoveries led to the creation of the atomic bomb made him quite depressed. Here's a watch found in the Hiroshima rubble that's permanently stopped at 8:15 a.m., the exact time of the bomb's detonation. The details of the Manhattan Project were so secretive that nearly all of the 100,000 plus workers had no idea why they did their jobs. For example, a laundrywoman was given the task of holding up an instrument and listening for a clicking noise. It was a Geiger counter testing the radiation levels of uniforms. While the atomic bombings were devastating, the most destructive bombing raid in world history actually took place a few months earlier. The U.S. Army used incendiary bombs to light a giant flaming X over the center of Tokyo. It left over 100,000 people dead and 1 million more homeless.
Yeah, war's not good. Not good. All right, here's let's see. Yep. All right, got a couple more videos here, and then we'll continue on to our regularly scheduled program.
It's not a nuclear weapon for Nagasaki. The war not ended, and the Manhattan Project had made a core for another plutonium bomb. And on August 10th, 1945, told President Truman that they were ready to drop it in a week. And this is when Truman came back and said, you can't drop any atomic bomb without my order, and stop that process. But even at that point, they wanted to get it all ready to go so that if the president changed his mind, and they expected that he would, if the war went on, they would be able to immediately ship it out and then use it. They didn't know exactly what the next target would be. They had not gotten there, but they had 2 more targets on their list of possible atomic targets, one of which was Kokura, which was the target that the Nagasaki bomb was actually meant for, and they couldn't drop it. And so it's pretty likely that could have been it, but it also, the president would have been in charge. And he, on the day that the Japanese surrendered, he told the British ambassador that sadly he felt that he was going to have to order the use of another bomb on Tokyo. It didn't go forward, but it leads to a lot of interesting what ifs.
And now remember that guy as well, because we're going to use a program that he created a little bit later to go through some possible scenarios. But the history is cloudy to say the least. Now let's get into the booms, the bombs, the destruction capabilities of these weapons. This is the Tsar Bomba, and this looks to be downtown Manhattan in New York. All right, let's rewind that a little bit. Heavy destruction, 16 kilometers. I would assume that means complete and absolute total destruction. Like there's no buildings, there's nothing. That's all of Manhattan, that entire island. And I believe it'll stretch out possibly even until Connecticut. Definitely the radioactive waste would. Just insane levels of power. And I thought this was a really, really informative video, specifically about the Tsar Bomba. And then right after this, we'll jump into the bombs.
The bomb was 8 meters long, had a diameter of nearly 2.6 meters, and a weight of more than 27 tons, the weight of 5 elephants. Inside the weapon, a small atomic bomb is shaped like a sphere at the top of the casing. The top of the sphere contains conventional chemical explosives surrounding a sphere of the beryllium mirror casing, inside of which is a small plutonium sphere about 4 to 6 inches in diameter. Below this atomic bomb is the hydrogen or fusion bomb. It consists of a cylinder made of uranium. The fuel for the fusion reaction, lithium deuteride, at the core of the cylinder sits a road of plutonium. The aircraft, piloted by Andrei Dernovtsev, took off from the Kola Peninsula. It was joined by an observer plane to measure the impact of the bomb. At approximately 11:32 a.m. Moscow time, Tsar Bomba was dropped over the Mityushika Bay test site on the deserted island of Novaya Zemlya. The bomb was equipped with a special parachute that would slow its fall, allowing the plane to fly a safe distance from blast. Barometric sensors set the bomb to detonate 4 kilometers above the ground. The barometric sensor detects the final altitude. 32 bridge wire detonators release an electric spark to detonate the chemical bomb. The chemical bomb detonation causes compression inside the plutonium and releases bursts of neutrons. 1 atom of plutonium is hit by a neutron, splits into 2, and releases energy, producing 2 or 3 additional neutrons. Each of these goes on to react or split other plutonium atoms, thus maintaining a chain reaction that produces a high level of heat, higher than even that at the center of our sun, 100 million degrees Celsius. The center of the sun is 15 million degrees Celsius. The temperature results in an atomic explosion. The fission explosion creates high energy gamma rays and X-rays, which heat up the styrofoam and turns it into plasma. The heat and pressure of the plasma compress the fusion cylinder, causing the lithium deuteride to react. This compresses the fusion cylinder, causing the lithium deuteride to react and form helium and more neutrons. The neutrons cause the uranium casing and plutonium rod to undergo more fission reactions. This causes more pressure on lithium deuteride. This produces more fusion, which releases more neutrons, which causes more fission. The positive feedback loop fission-fusion reaction goes back and forth until a huge explosion occurs, ripping everything apart. Amazingly, all these events happen in only 600 billionths of a second. That produced a mushroom cloud more than 60 kilometers high. The resulting damage was equally massive, and buildings more than 160 kilometers away were reportedly damaged. In addition, it was estimated that heat from the blast would have caused third-degree burns up to 100 kilometers distant. Despite its incredible destructive power, the Tsar Bomba was never actually used in combat. It was designed as a warning to the West during the Cold War and served its purpose well. The Tsar Bomba showed everyone just how destructive nuclear weapons can be and served as a reminder of the devastation that could be caused if they were ever used in war.
The atomic bomb is one of the most fascinating things that we have not only created, but that I think we will ever be a part of. And next thing I wanted to talk about was, well, what's going on? What's happening during these types of things, and specifically what happened with Fat Man and Little Boy, because that's the topic of discussion when considering Oppenheimer, the movie. I've talked about fission versus fusion on the show, particularly when it comes to stars, but we'll talk about it now in the context of a bomb. The immense destructive power of atomic weapons derives from a sudden release of energy produced by splitting the nuclei of the fissile elements making up the bomb's core. The U.S. developed two types of atomic bombs during the Second World War. The first, Little Boy, was a gun-type weapon with a uranium core. Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. The second weapon, dropped on Nagasaki, was called Fat Man and was an implosion-type device with a plutonium core. Fission. The isotope uranium-235 and plutonium-239 were selected by the atomic scientists because they readily undergo fission. Fission occurs when a neutron strikes the nucleus of either isotope, splitting the nucleus into fragments and releasing a tremendous amount of energy. The fission process becomes self-sustaining as neutrons produced by the splitting of atoms strike nearby nuclei and produce more fission. This is known as a chain reaction and is what causes an atomic explosion. When a uranium-235 bomb absorbs a neutron and fissions into two new atoms, it releases three new neutrons and some binding energy. Two neutrons do not continue the reaction because they are lost or absorbed by a uranium-238 atom. However, one neutron does collide with an atom of uranium-235, which then fissions and releases two neutrons and some binding energy. Both of those neutrons collide with uranium-235 atoms, each of which fission and release between 1 and 3 atoms, and so on. This causes a nuclear chain reaction. And then you can kind of look at the pictures here. You can see the implosion method That's kind of what the first stage of the SAR bomba was. So if you kind of remember that, as opposed to the gun type method where you're shooting something at the core and then having it explode, the implosion method is 360 degrees around it. You're going to start blowing and setting off these charges, and then that process will create compression and an explosion. Criticality. In order to detonate an atomic weapon, you need a critical mass of fissionable material. This means you need enough uranium-235 or plutonium-239 to ensure that neutrons released by fission will strike another nucleus, thus producing a chain reaction. The more fissionable material you have, the greater the odds that such an event will occur. Critical mass is defined as the amount of material at which a neutron produced by a fission process will, on average, create another fission event. Little Boy and Fat Man utilize different elements and completely separate methods of construction in order to function as nuclear weapons. Little Boy detonated due to a fission chain reaction involving the isotope uranium-235 of uranium, while Fat Man used plutonium's 239 form. Right, Little Boy. Little Boy was powered by the uranium isotope U-235 in a process that didn't come easily to the many Manhattan Project scientists working on the uranium extraction and enrichment process. Most uranium found naturally in the world exists as uranium-238, leaving only 0.7% of naturally existing uranium as the uranium-235 isotope. When a neutron bombards U-238, the isotope often captures the neutron to become U-239, failing to fission and thus failing to instigate a chain reaction that would detonate a bomb. The first challenge of the project was thus to determine the most efficient way to separate and purify uranium-235 from the overly abundant uranium-238. Standard methods of separation could not be used due to the strong chemical similarity between the two isotopes. In order to avoid wasting time on one new method that could later prove insufficient to produce enough 235 to allow the atomic bomb to reach critical mass, General Leslie Groves consulted with lead scientists of the project and agreed to investigate simultaneously 4 separate methods of separating and purifying uranium-235. Gaseous diffusion, centrifuge, electromagnetic separation, and liquid thermal diffusion. Once enough U-235 was obtained to power the bomb, Little Boy was constructed using a gun-type design that fired one amount of uranium-235 at another to combine the two masses. This combination created a critical mass that set off a fission reaction to eventually detonate the bomb. The two masses of uranium-235 had to combine with one quickly enough to avoid the spontaneous fission of the atom, which would cause the bomb to fizzle and thus fail to explode. So that was Little Man. Now we go to Fat Man. Powered by plutonium, Fat Man could not use the same gun-type design that allowed Little Man to explode effectively. The form of plutonium collected from the nuclear reactors at Hanford, Washington for the bomb would not allow for this strategy. The Hanford plutonium emerged from the reactors less pure than the initial plutonium extracted from Ernest O. Lawrence's Berkeley lab, instead containing traces of isotope plutonium-240 as opposed to the desired plutonium-239. Plutonium-240's higher fission rate would cause the atoms to undergo spontaneous fission before the gun-type design could bring two masses of plutonium together, which would lower the energy involved in the actual detonation of the bomb. Thus, a new design was required. Physicist Seth Niedermeyer at Los Alamos constructed a design for the plutonium bomb that used conventional explosives around a central plutonium mass to quickly squeeze and consolidate the plutonium, increasing the pressure and density of the substance. An increased density allowed the plutonium to reach its critical mass, firing neurons and allowing the fission chain reaction to proceed. To detonate the bomb, the explosives were ignited, releasing a shockwave that compressed the inner plutonium and led to its explosion. And then they have more here. This is the Atomic Heritage Foundation, kind of giving a little bit of a background on these things. And now, I don't know if I should really go into the different purifying process of the uranium-235. I'm not an expert on it. I don't really want to become an expert on it because that's just too much for me. So let's go to dropping the nukes. This is, if you remember in the video earlier, I said to remember this particular person. If not, if you're just watching a clip, Alex Wellerstein is a professor, but he's also a programmer, and he created this thing that I actually discovered when I was in high school. It's called Nuke Map. And it's a really cool and effective map that shows you what a nuke would look like if it dropped on your head. We're going to start in New York, but let's go over to Pittsburgh, where I am living currently. There's downtown. Look, beautiful city. There's downtown, look. Let's look at a satellite image. All the pretty great Allegheny Passage. There's the Three Rivers right there. There's Point State Park. There's the hotel over here, Liberty Ave. Beautiful place, right? See PNC Park, Acrisure Stadium right there. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. Highmark Stadium where the soccer team plays. But that's not what we're here for. We're here to see what would happen if we dropped a bomb on it. Now, let's look at the first bomb that was dropped, Little Boy, a 15 kiloton bomb. Now let's simulate it as if it was dropped on our wonderful little city. And let's see, mushroom cloud. There we go. There we go. There we go. Got to get these advanced options. Now let's drop the bomb. Downtown Pittsburgh. You see that line right there? That's about 2 kilometers. All right. So just think about that for size and reference. Let's drop the bomb in 3, 3, 3, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. There's the bomb. You can see downtown itself is absolutely destroyed. You can also see the crater as well, which I think is really cool. All right, so the inside radius let's change it. Radius 156 feet across, over 75,000 square feet of a radius of just the crater alone. About 75 feet deep and about 312 feet across from lip to lip. Now, fireball radius 591 feet. So anybody pretty much within 600 feet is going to be engulfed in the massive fireball. Heavy blast damage radius. You can see it kind of stretches out almost to, I guess it's getting PPG Paints Arena. And then radiation, heavy blast damage radius. You can see kind of right there. All of the buildings that are within this blinking light are toast. They're gone. All right. Moderate blast damage. Most residential buildings collapse. Injuries are universal. Fatalities are widespread. The chances of a fire starting in commercial and residential buildings are high, and buildings so damaged are at high risk of spreading fire. Often used as a benchmark for moderate damage in cities. So pretty much all the way out to PNC Park, you can see the Andy Warhol Museum is getting engulfed in that as well, and it's even crossing across the river. So it's really starting to hit people. This thermal radiation radius, you're going to get 3rd-degree burns within about 1.25 miles from the epicenter of where the bomb was dropped, which is concerning because that reaches almost out to Acrisure Stadium. So third-degree burns extend through the layers of the skin and are often painless because they destroy the pain nerves. They can cause severe scarring or disablement and can require amputation. 100% probability for third-degree burns at this yield. And then final thing for this particular fallout is the mushroom cloud. So the cloud itself will rise up about 4 miles high. It'll be about 2 and almost 3 miles across at the top of the mushroom cloud head. So very, very tall in the air. But guess what? We're just getting started, right? So keep this image in your mind. That's the Hiroshima bomb. That's 15 kilotons. All right, 15 kilotons. Let's look at Fat Man. Let's see what they got going on here, right? Let's check it out. Let's drop this one. Keep this in mind. A lot of casualties as a result of this one, unfortunately. Oh, look, Acrisure Stadium. Gonzo. Now you can see the radiation has increased very, very. And this is only an extra 5 kilotons. And now you can see all the way over to the Oliver Building, Forbes Ave, Duquesne University, a private college, completely just eviscerated, gone, totally done. And a little bit bigger of a fireball radius. You can see the crater is a little bit bigger as well, not too much bigger. The mushroom cloud altitude is about 4.5 miles high. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Light blast damage now extends all the way out to Shenley Heights, Carnegie Mellon University, UPMC, a hospital in Shadyside. So it's getting out pretty far. Now, many people won't know what these particular areas are, but just know that it is going out about 2.85 miles light blast damage. Glass windows can be expected to break. This can cause many injuries in a surrounding population who comes to a window after seeing the flash of a nuclear explosion, which travels faster than the pressure wave, often used as a benchmark for light damage in cities. All right, you ready to start going up a little bit? That's 20 kilotons, and we're seeing a lot of different things. Let's try casualties now. Estimated fatalities if this were dropped. 71,000 dead, 73,000 injured. The destructive powers of these bombs are very, very powerful. But that's just the start. That's the start. That's 20 kilotons. That's nothing. Now let's continue going with just straight up fission, pure fission. Let's not do any of this hydrogen stuff. No. No hydrogen bombs. 500 kilotons. Let's drop it. Yikes. Deaths go up to 165,000. And now you can see the radiation. Radiation goes out. Radiation almost goes up to Canada, right up by Rochester, New York, Ithaca, New York. The radiation will come all the way from Pittsburgh into a different state. This means probably the entire city of Pittsburgh and the majority of the surrounding areas are going to be greatly impacted by this. The fireball radius in itself is about half a mile. Heavy blast damage. Remember what that was with the Little Boy and Fat Man? Where maybe you would be able to get out to Forbes Ave, you'd be able to get out to maybe PPG Paints Arena where the Penguins play. With this, you're getting the Andy Warhol Museum, you're getting PNC Park, and heavy blast damage, meaning concrete buildings are severely damaged or demolished. 100% fatalities. Then look at the radiation damage going back to Acrisure Stadium. And then you'll be able to see thermal radiation, 3rd-degree burns up to almost 5 miles away. You're going to get 3rd-degree burns. Light blast damage, 6 miles about. And the mushroom cloud itself, 10.8 miles high. And the head diameter at the top is 12.9 miles. And here we go with right here, we'll look at the fallout. You can kind of see right here the nuclear fallout from this explosion. Very bad all the way up until Ford City, Kittening. I don't know these cities, but they're pretty far outside of Pittsburgh, just to give you some context. 100 rads per hour. Just incredible destruction. Incredible. But that's only 500 kilotons. That's nothing. Nothing to sneeze at. But that's fission. Let's go into hydrogen bombs. Let's go into the megatons, right? The B-83. According to this, the largest bomb in the U.S. arsenal. So according to this program, this is the biggest that the U.S. has. I don't believe it. I think the U.S. probably has something bigger, but this is public knowledge, so we never know. Let's look at this. Let's drop the bomb. Estimated fatalities. I mean, you just look. It is a different type of bomb, as you can see. And part of the reason for this is because I am doing it at a particular height, but I don't know the ideal height for this. This is just an example, right? But you can kind of look downtown, gone. It's all gone. It's completely toast. No more Steelers, no more Pirates, no more Penguins, no more soccer. We're getting all the way out here to the Pittsburgh International Airport, which is about a 20-minute drive from downtown, is being impacted by this explosion. And now this mushroom cloud is 12.7 miles high and about 20 miles wide. Pretty big. Estimated fatalities for this is up into 282,000 fatalities. Estimated injuries, about 400,000 as well. But folks, that's not as big as we can go. We can go bigger. And I think you know, and I know where we're going to go next. We have to. We have to go to the Tsar Bomba. We have to, right? And now what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of fatalities, and you're going to see why this thing was so big. Look at that. Let's zoom in a little bit. See what's happened to the great city. All right, that's downtown. You can see Acrisure Stadium right there. The fireball radius in itself is all the way out here. So everything in there is getting burnt up. Wow. Heavy blast damage. Look at this. Everything in this radius is leveled. At about 3 miles out, the fireball is going to go. And at about almost 6 miles, 5.5 miles, all buildings are going to be just gone, just donezo. And then kind of zoom out. As you can see, this is going to have impacts into the next state over. Ohio is going to even feel the effects of this bomb. Light blast damage. Remember, so windows are going to be breaking. People are going to be smacked in the face by the wind. Most residential buildings are going to collapse within a 13-mile radius. Very hard to even understand. There's going to be light damage, 3rd-degree burns, almost 40 miles away. This is a hot mother trucker. The mushroom cloud for this, 27 miles high and about 94 miles wide. And then you can look at the fallout right here. Not as much as we've seen with other ones, but if you just look, the destructive power alone is enough to have a major impact. And now for the finale. Let's do the Tsar Bomba, 100 megatons. Let's see what we get. To see all of this, and especially to see, and I'll go back to it, but that first one, when it's 20 kilotons versus 100 megatons. We're talking magnitudes and magnitudes of people who are gonna be toast. Literally toast. Man. All right, I guess we won't do casualties for this one. Let's just detonate it. Look at this, man. All right, let's see what's going on in downtown. Let's see. Downtown is a crater. Look at this crater. This is the lip of the crater that has been created. Almost reaches out to, this is the crater. This is just what's going to be left behind from this bomb. All the way out to Acrisure Stadium. Steelers players going to be part of a new crater in the city. The fireball radius itself goes out to 4 miles. Kind of going back out, you can kind of see the airport again there in the upper left. Moderate blast damage. Most residential buildings collapse. Injuries are universal. Fatalities widespread. 20 miles away. Just complete and absolute destruction. 3rd-degree burns this time going out 45 miles. and you'll have light blast damage for 57 miles. The mushroom cloud itself, 32 miles high and over 127 miles wide. Wow. Your choice of burst height is too high to produce significant local fallout. Okay. Can we see if we can add another one? Let's see. Max we can do is 100 megatons. But this is a nuke map. Really cool app. I highly suggest you kind of play around with it just to see the pure just actually let's go back to Pittsburgh and let's go back to the little boy and see the difference. Wild. In this example, you're good if you're, I mean, obviously you're not good, but like when comparing this to the SAR bomba was like pretty much right where you see the radiation. That was the crater, just the crater left behind. Oh man, these things are powerful. And then here is another app that I looked at as well. You can kind of see the little guy. It's a really cool animation that I like. In Pittsburgh, boom, explosion. There's the heat, shockwave, radiation, fireball, radiation, shockwave, heat, fatalities, and then all the way up to a SAR bomba. You just see how zoomed out it is. Just an incredible amount of power. The show is not stopping now. But I do want to kind of make a closing point on nuclear bombs in general. I hope that in my lifetime we can find a way to not use these for means of killing others. I hope we can use these as a form of energy. Because the energy created by a nuclear explosion, imagine you give 100th of that power to a local city. Nuclear reactors. I had some around me when I was in Connecticut. And I do think that there should be probably more. Obviously, you need a lot of safety precautions, of course, but my lifetime, there hasn't been any major explosions near me that I've been like, oh crap, I need to evacuate. And there's more than one nuclear facilities around me where they produce nuclear power. But the bombs themselves, the amount of power, the amount of destruction that they are capable of is somewhat hard to understand, somewhat hard to really put your finger on just what it would do. And hopefully, these are some good examples. And now I want to kind of give a more broader, I guess political statement. something that I thought of. Right now, we are gearing up for a massive presidential election in 2024. And there was a debate about, or there has been a debate about what's important with the candidates, and I am speaking, of course, of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And I'll make my specifics on them in a second, but to kind of set the tone, I think we're focusing on the wrong issues. And Trump is getting indicted, and they're throwing charges at him, trying to get him into jail. And I think while it is important to, if somebody breaks the law, to hold them accountable, I don't know if it's being applied where it should be. And let me explain. There have been war crimes that have been committed within my lifetime by the United States government. And I think that's more of a concern. Civilians overseas being killed by indiscriminate attacks or direct attacks, I think is something that should end you up as the commander in chief. The man in charge should end you up in jail. The loss of life, especially life that's innocent, is more important than saying the election was rigged. And you can disagree with me, but I think one thing is more important than the other, and we're able to disagree. And if you can convince me of an argument as to why the issues with Donald Trump's indictments is more important than his record when it comes to killing innocent civilians overseas, then I'll listen. But as of right now, I'm alone here, and I don't see it. And apparently, neither does Brown University. This is a paper put out by Netta C. Crawford, December 7th, 2020. Afghanistan's rising civilian death toll due to airstrikes. When the United States tightens its rules of engagement and restricts airstrikes where civilians are at risk, civilian casualties tend to go down. When it loosens those restrictions, civilians are injured and killed in greater numbers. In 2017, the Pentagon relaxed its rules of engagement for airstrikes and escalated the air war in Afghanistan. The aim was to gain leverage at the bargaining table. From 2017 through 2019, civilian deaths due to U.S. and allied forces airstrikes in Afghanistan dramatically increased. In 2019, airstrikes killed 700 civilians, more civilians than in any other year since the beginning of the war in 2001 and 2002. After the U.S. and Taliban reached a peace agreement in late February 2020, U.S. and other international airstrikes declined. They declined. And so did the harm to civilians caused by those strikes. The Afghan government is now negotiating with the Taliban, and as part of a broader offensive, perhaps aimed at increasing Afghan government leverage in the talks, airstrikes by the Afghan Air Force have increased. As a consequence, the Afghan Air Force is harming more Afghan civilians than at any time in its history. The uptick in civilians killed by AAF, or Afghan Air Force, airstrikes between July and September 2020 was particularly striking. In the first 6 months of this year, the AAF killed 86 Afghan civilians and injured 103 civilians in airstrikes. That rate of harm nearly doubled in the next 3 months. Between July and the end of September, the Afghan Air Force killed 70 civilians and 90 civilians were injured. As with the international airstrikes, some of this harm could be avoided by tighter rules of engagement as well as better training. A negotiated ceasefire might also yield results at the bargaining table and at the same time avoid escalating harm to Afghan civilians from airstrikes. I highly encourage it. Once again, I will put the links to all of this stuff in the description so that you can on your own read it as well. And if you disagree with the conclusion of this particular paper, let me know. If I'm wrong on this, then let me know. If the numbers that they are citing, the U.S. Central Command airstrikes and weapon releases in Afghanistan from 2011 to 2020, number of weapons releases, you can kind of see strikes, sorties with at least one weapon release. 2016, somebody gets elected and goes all the way up till 2019 in terms of weapon releases. 1337 in 2016, all the way up to 7423. 7,423 weapon releases in 2019. During the U.S. war in Afghanistan, the number of civilians killed by international forces airstrikes has varied depending on the tactics and priorities the U.S. has placed on preventing civilian casualties. They changed their priorities, you know? In 2008, international forces airstrikes killed 552 civilians. International military forces led by the U.S. are responsible for the majority of those killed by airstrikes from 2015 through 2019. 1,357 killed by international forces compared to 461 killed by the AAF. The number of civilians killed by international airstrikes increased about 330% from 2016. The last full year of the Obama administration to 2019, the most recent year for which there is complete data from the United Nations. (2016, 2017, 2018, 2019). (2017) it goes down, but it jumps right back up in 2018. And here is condolence payments for Afghanistan for deaths and injuries. In 2015 and 2016, 297, totaling $1.3 million paid condolence payments. 26 in 2017, $128,000. 2018, we have 56 payments, 163,000. 2019, 65 payments for $314,000. War is not good. And the after effects are not good. But while I will argue that there are things that are more important for our country and for the world than a classified documents case or claims about a stolen election, there are things that I think are more valuable to be brought to light. Things that I think actually make a difference and things that are real crimes where somebody should go to prison for. And as you'll see, Donald Trump's not the only person guilty of that. New York Times. Documents obtained through a lawsuit reveal how biases led to the deadly August 2021 blunder and that officials made misleading statements concealing their assessments of civilian casualties. In the chaotic final days of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021, U.S. military analysts observed a white Toyota Corolla stop at what they believed was an Islamist state compound. The Americans were already on edge. 3 days earlier, a suicide bomber had killed scores of Afghans, 13 U.S. troops at a main gate of the Kabul airport. Now, officials had intelligence that there would be another attack there, and that it would involve a white Corolla. They tracked the car around Kabul for the next several hours. After it pulled into a gated courtyard near the airport, they authorized a drone strike. Hours later, U.S. officials announced they had successfully thwarted an attack. As reports of civilian deaths surfaced later that day, they issued statements saying they had no indications, but would assess the claims and were investigating whether a secondary explosion may have killed civilians. But portions of a U.S. Central Command investigation obtained by the New York Times shows that military analysts reported within minutes of the strikes that civilians may have been killed, and within 3 hours had assessed that at least 3 children were killed. The documents also provide detailed examples of how assumptions and biases led to the deadly blunder. Military analysts wrongly concluded, for example, that a package loaded into the car contained explosives because of its careful handling and size, and that the driver's erratic route was evidence that he was trying to evade surveillance. The investigation was completed a week and a half after the strike and was never released, but the New York Times has obtained 66 partially redacted pages of it through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against Central Command. The Pentagon previously acknowledged that the strike was a tragic mistake that killed 10 civilians and told the Times that a new action plan intended to protect civilians drew on lessons learned from the incident. Within 20 minutes after the strike, multiple military officials and members of the strike team learned that analysts had seen possible civilian casualties in video feeds, according to their sworn statements for the investigation. 2 to 3 hours after the attack, analysts who had reviewed the footage frame by frame assessed that 3 children had been killed. An officer then shared that information with 2 top commanders in Afghanistan, Major General Christopher Donahue, the ground force commander, and Rear Admiral Peter G. Vasley. In sworn statements, 6 of 9 witnesses described learning immediately after strikes that civilians were in the area and may have been killed. Later that day, Central Command said in a statement that officials were, quote, assessing the possibility of civilian casualties, but had, quote, no indications at this time. An update several hours later noted that powerful subsequent explosions may have caused civilian casualties, but did not mention that analysts have already assessed 3 children were killed. 3 days later, General Mark A. Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told reporters that the strikes were, quote, righteous and had killed an ISIS facilitator as well as others, but who they were, quote, we don't know. We'll try and sort through all of that. Over the next several weeks, Pentagon officials continue to say that an ISIS target was killed in the strike, even as evidence mounted to the contrary. On September 10th, a Times investigation based on video evidence and interviews with more than a dozen of Mr. Ahmadi's co-workers and family members in Kabul found no evidence that explosives were present in the vehicle. This is the guy who was one of the victims. Mr. Ahmadi, who worked as an electrical engineer for a California-based aid group, had spent the day picking up his employer's laptop, taking colleagues to and from work, and loading canisters of water into his trunk to bring home to his family. Officials insisted that their target had visited an ISIS safe house, but the Times found that the building was actually the home of Mr. Ahmadi's boss, whose laptop he was picking up. A week after the Times investigation was published, military officials acknowledged that 10 civilians had been killed and that Mr. Ahmadi posed no threat and had no connection to ISIS. Read this article. Watch the video. Look at this. Even one. Even one. Personally, for me, I think there are things. Both presidents have been accused of having undeclassified their documents. I'm simply making the argument that there's things in this world that are simply more important. And if we're going to throw these people into jail or try and throw them into jail, let's do it for legitimate reasons or more legitimate reasons. Not to say that current cases aren't legitimate. I'm not an expert on this current case, but I think I'm an expert on knowing what's worse than somebody not declassifying documents or saying the election was fake. That's my thoughts. Our final story before we end this. This was a good show. Good show. A lot of stuff. I have no idea how long we've been going for. Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb took a while to get through. Carmela has been asleep the whole time, but now she's awoken with her ears out. So we got through that. So maybe this last story might have to get cut a little bit short as she's coming over. Come here. Come here, mamas. There you go. Oh. She's tired. She's sleeping. We went on a run today. And she's been doing good. The thing is, she comes out of the gate. She goes sprinting, literally sprinting, because she's so excited to do it. But by the end of it, she's so tired. And I don't have enough space to really bring a water bottle for her. So by the time we're getting close to the end, and I mean, I'm only doing maybe 4 miles at the most, but she usually I'm dragging her towards the end. And then she gets back and she'll want to play with her ball. And I'm like, where was that energy 10 minutes ago when you were dying? But she likes to play with her tennis ball, as most golden retrievers do. Anyway, final story. Scientists discover secret of virgin birth and switch on the ability in female flies. Huh? Let's dive into it. For the first time, scientists have managed to induce virgin birth in an animal that usually reproduces sexually. The fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster. Once induced in this fruit fly, this ability is passed on through the generations. The offspring can reproduce either sexually if there are males around or by virgin birth if there aren't. For most animals, reproduction is sexual. It involves a female's eggs being fertilized by a male sperm. Virgin birth or parthenogenesis is the process by which an egg develops into an embryo without fertilization by sperm. A male is not needed. The offspring of a virgin birth are not exact clones of their mother, but are genetically very similar and are always female. Quote, we're the first to show that you can engineer virgin births to happen in an animal. It was very exciting to see a virgin fly produce an embryo able to develop to adulthood and then repeat the process. Dr. Alice Sperling, a researcher at the University of Cambridge and first author of the paper. She added, in our genetically manipulated flies, the females waited to find a male for half their lives, about 40 days, but then gave up and proceeded to have a virgin birth. So maybe that means that they're able to know that they're virgins. Interesting. In the experiments, only 1 to 2% of the second generation of female flies with the ability for virgin birth produced offspring, and this occurred only when there were no male flies around. When males were available, the females mated and reproduced in the normal way. Switching to a virgin birth can be a survival strategy. A one-off generation of virgin birth can help keep the species going. This study is published today in the journal Current Biology. To achieve their results, researchers first sequenced the genomes of 2 strains of other species of fruit fly called Drosophila mercatorium. One strand needs males to reproduce, the other reproduces only through virgin birth. Researchers identified the genes that were switched on or off when the flies were reproducing without fathers. With the candidate genes for virgin birth ability identified in Drosophila mercatorium, the researchers altered what they thought were the corresponding genes in the model fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster. It worked. Drosophila melanogaster suddenly acquired the ability for virgin birth. The research involved over 220,000 virgin fruit flies and took 6 years to complete. Coming on in, brother. Sorry, Carmela is awake, so she's barging through. She has this rib bone that she's been liking a lot, so apologies. Let's get back into it. Key to discovery was the fact that this work was done in Drosophila melanogaster. The researchers said it would have been incredibly difficult in any other animal. This fly has been the model organism for research in genetics for over 100 years, and its genes are very well understood. Sperling, who carried out this work for the Department of Genetics, has recently moved to Cambridge Crop Science Center to work on crop pests in hopes to eventually investigate why virgin birth in insects may be becoming more common, particularly in pest species. If there's continued selection pressure for virgin birth in insect pests, which there seems to be, it will eventually lead to them reproducing only in this way. It could become a real problem for agriculture because females produce only females, so their ability to spread doubles. That would be a bad chain. Talk about a chain reaction. Speaking about atomic bombs, that's a bad chain reaction. Girls only having girls, and then girls, and then girls, and then girls. Oh, man. The females of some egg-laying animals, including birds, lizards, and snakes, can switch naturally to give birth without males. But virgin birth in animals that normally sexually reproduce is rare, often only observed in zoo animals, and usually happens when the female has been isolated for a long time and has little hope of finding a mate. Interesting stuff. Interesting episode. Thank you so much for listening, as we have Carmela deciding to join us for the last couple seconds. Thank you, Miss Carmela. Thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. I hope that you listen to what I have to say. I hope you disagree with some of it. I hope you agree with some of it. And if you agree or disagree, please let me know. And spread joy, spread love, happiness to those around you. You don't know how long you're going to be here. Thank you so much. This has been the Zach Moore Podcast.